So the first reason is obviously the lazy label, right? But is Gen Z really that lazy? I don't really think so. So lazy is the default insult that every older generation throws at the youngest one. So Gen Z is just the current holder of the oldest stereotype in history. The youngest generation is always lazy. And this is really not new. So before Gen Z, millennials were called lazy. Before millennials, Gen X probably got the same title. And the target changes, but the accusation stays the same. So why does this happen all the time? Because as our society progresses forward, each younger generation usually grows up with more economic comfort, better technology, and easier access to resources than the older ones, right? So life gets more efficient, tools get smarter, information gets faster, things that used to require huge effort can now be done within just less friction. And that is where exactly the judgment starts. The older generations will look at this like, you had it easier, you didn't work as hard, you didn't even know what real hardship was. And from there, the lazy gets slapped on the face of the youngest generation, which is the Gen Z. So my father used to tell me all the time that, hey, you're the luckiest generation ever. When I was young, I had to walk 5 miles round trip every day and only get to eat meat once a year. And you should not complain about anything in your life. So, but... What the older generations are reacting to in this case is not really laziness. It's actually reacting to the reduced visible struggle. So when previous generations had to do things the hard way, the hardship become part of the defined work ethics. So when younger people achieve similar results with less visible struggle, it feels wrong to them. And it feels like the younger generation is kind of cornered, like they didn't even earn it. When a task that used to take 5 hours now takes only 1 hour, the older generation may see like less sweat from that effort and assume that that's less character. When life becomes more convenient, they assume people will become softer and weaker, but that's just not true. So Gen Z is not unique to getting that label. They're just the current generation to receive that label. And the second reason why Gen Z is so hated right now is because Gen Z is the least obedient generation. Gen Z grew up on the internet. They grew up in an environment where information is very transparent, opinions are everywhere, and the authority is constantly being challenged. So the previous generations, they used to think that information just flow in one direction, right? So you listen to your boss, your teacher, your company, the news, and that's just the way it is. And yes, the older generations, they used the internet before, but growing up on the internet versus only getting to use internet like when you are 30 years old or 20 years old, it's completely different. Gen Z is so used to asking that, why does it have to be this way? Who decided that? Does this actually make sense? And most importantly, just because something is normal, does it really make it right? So that really creates this generation that is so much open-minded, so much more outspoken, and so much more willing to challenge things that feel inefficient, outdated, fake, or unfair. And that is exactly where the friction starts. Because, let's be honest, corporations do not actually want too much independent thinking. They say that they want innovation, they say that they want people to speak up, they say that they value fresh perspectives, but in reality, companies still reward alignment, obedience, knowing when to stop asking questions, and at the end of the day, they just want people that are very easy to control. A corporation is not democracy, right? So in many ways, it is probably the least democratic space in our whole society. A corporation is hierarchy, right? And hierarchies work best when people follow the system, not when they constantly challenge it and question it. So when Gen Z enters the workplace and starts to questioning the rules, challenging workplace norms or pushing back on things that they don't think make sense. And many employers really don't see that as being intelligent. They see it as, attitude, they see it as disrespect, they see it as, being too hard to manage. And yes, there are definitely companies that genuinely value those fresh perspectives, but most employers do not like pushbacks, to be honest. And that is especially true in some of the Asian countries. So the issue is not just that Gen Z is lazy or too sensitive. A big part of this is that they're just so hard to control. And the third reason that why employers are so tired of Gen Z is that Gen Z has a much lower tolerance for employers than the older generations did. And this is not just about attitude, it's about the environment that they grew up and the economy that they stepped in. So first, Gen Z grew up with a lot less exposure to hardship than the older generations, like we just talked about. And they also grew up in a world with smaller families. Let me explain. So the global fertility rate dropped, from around 5 births per woman in the 1960s to roughly 2.2 today. And I'm not even going to talk about the reasons why people stopped having kids, which will be another video. The point here is simple. So when families have fewer kids, each child gets more parental attention and more emotional investment and more resources. And when you grow up with more focus, more protection, more support, you're naturally taught to value yourself more. So you're less likely to believe that, your role in life is to suffer for a corporation that you work for. In many places like China, that's even more obvious because of the one-child policy. However, the older generations were different. Many of them were raised with a survival mindset. Stability came first. You get a job, you keep the job, and you tolerate a lot because losing a job felt dangerous. So their tolerance for bosses, hierarchy, pressure, unfairness was naturally much, much higher than the Gen Z. But Gen Z really came in with a different baseline. They're more self-prioritized. They're more self-aware of the boundaries. They're willing to ask, should I even accept this? And that really clashes directly with how companies operate today under capitalism. So a company is not built to emotionally value you. A company is built to get the best return possible from the salaries that they pay you. Right? That's just the logic of the system. It's completely rational, and you can't blame anything. So if a company pays you for $1, it wants more than $1 from you back in terms of productivity, energy, time, and flexibility and output. So naturally speaking, it's very fair, it's very reasonable for the employers to push on you. They want longer availability, faster responses, more ownership, more adaptability, with higher performance while all controlling the cost. And again, from the employer's perspective, that is completely rational and it's completely normal. But Gen Z is the generation that is the least willing to accept the deal without questioning it. And on top of that, they really have alternatives. The other generations were trained to believe that success followed a narrow path, get a responsible job, stay loyal, climb slowly, retire safely. But Gen Z does not buy into that nearly as much. Gen Z grew up in a very decentralized economy. There are far more ways to make money right now outside of traditional employer system. You have content creation, e-commerce, building products with AI, you name it. So when Gen Z feels underpaid or disrespected, drained, burned out, they're not even thinking about should I even endure? Instead, they're thinking that I have alternatives, I have options. And that is exactly what employers are really tired of. Not because Gen Z works less hard by default, but because Gen Z is much less willing to be squeezed by the system that sees labor as something to optimize. Whew. First take, get it down in one take. Camera 2.